A 14-year-old girl made one last desperate phone call before vanishing forever. What investigators eventually discovered would expose America's most dangerous highway predator and revolutionize how law enforcement handles interstate crimes. This is a story about the importance of family communication, stranger danger awareness, and how one case changed criminal justice forever. On a warm February evening in 1990, Emily Marie Parker said goodnight to her mother and stepped out into the humid Florida air for what she believed would be a quick errand. She was supposed to drop off keys to a family she babysat for, a simple task that should have taken 30 minutes at most. Her mother, Linda Parker, watched from the kitchen window as her youngest daughter walked toward the street, her long brown hair catching the glow of the streetlights. It was the last time anyone in Emily's family would see her, but none of them knew that Emily had been keeping a secret about where she was really going. Emily Parker was not your typical runaway teenager. Born on May 5, 1975, in Marion County, Florida, she was described by teachers and neighbors as bright, responsible, and deeply connected to her family. She helped care for her elderly grandmother every afternoon after school, maintained excellent grades in her advanced placement classes, and had never displayed any warning signs that concerned her family. Her bedroom walls were covered with honor roll certificates and photographs of family gatherings. However, Emily had been keeping a dangerous secret that would ultimately change everything. For several weeks leading up to her disappearance, Emily had been meeting secretly with an 18-year-old named Ryan Mitchell, a young man whose troubled background should have served as a warning to anyone who cared about Emily's safety. Their relationship was carefully hidden through elaborate cover stories that allowed Emily to slip away from her normal routine without arousing suspicion from her family. What her parents didn't know was that Ryan was already on probation for auto theft, making their relationship both inappropriate and potentially dangerous. Ryan Mitchell's childhood was marked by instability and institutional failures. After his parents divorced in 1977, he and his 3 younger siblings were removed from their home by Child Protective Services following reports of neglect. What followed were years of group homes, temporary placements with overwhelmed foster families, and the kind of institutional instability that creates either remarkable resilience or dangerous behavioral patterns. Unfortunately for Emily, Ryan had developed concerning patterns of behavior that should have been red flags for any responsible adult. By 1990, Ryan was living in a rundown apartment in Clearwater, Florida, surviving on odd jobs and occasional petty crime. His criminal record included auto theft, shoplifting, and several violations of probation. His probation officer, overwhelmed with a caseload of over 100 at-risk young people, had already mentally classified Ryan as a high-risk individual destined for continued involvement with the criminal justice system. Ryan had learned early that survival often depended on manipulation and the ability to disappear when trouble arrived. Unfortunately, he hadn't yet learned that some predators are far more dangerous than anything he had previously encountered. The meeting between Emily and Ryan on February 2, 1990, near her mother's apartment complex in Orlando, would set in motion a chain of events that would eventually expose one of America's most prolific serial criminals. According to statements later given to authorities by Ryan's acquaintances, the 2 teenagers formed an immediate and intense connection. Emily, sheltered and inexperienced but yearning for independence, saw in Ryan someone who needed guidance and support. Ryan, street-smart and manipulative, but genuinely desperate for stability, saw in Emily everything he had never experienced. They promised to meet again the following evening, a promise that would seal both of their fates, though neither could have imagined the predator who was already observing them. That first meeting lasted 3 hours, sitting on a park bench while Emily was supposedly at her part-time job at the local library. They talked about dreams and disappointments, about the futures they imagined for themselves, and the past they wanted to escape. For Emily, Ryan represented freedom from what she perceived as the overprotective nature of her family. For Ryan, Emily represented salvation from a life that seemed to offer nothing but failure and disappointment. What neither of them realized was that their conversation was being overheard by someone who specialized in identifying vulnerable young people. When Emily left home on February 3, 1990, she told her mother she was going to drop off those babysitting keys to the Henderson family, who lived about 10 minutes away by bicycle. It was a deception that would haunt Linda Parker for the rest of her life, a lie that seemed so small and innocent at the time, but would have consequences beyond anyone's imagination. Instead of running her errand, Emily met Ryan at their agreed location, a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of Orlando, where teenagers could sit for hours nursing coffee and planning their escapes from adult supervision. Unfortunately, they weren't the only ones in that diner who were making plans. Together, Emily and Ryan began what they imagined would be a romantic adventure, a real-life version of the movies they had watched where young people overcame obstacles and found happiness. They spent the next few days moving between the apartments of Ryan's friends, inexpensive motels, and various locations where homeless people and runaways gathered for safety and companionship. They were two teenagers playing at being adults, completely unprepared for the dangers that surrounded them, or the predators who specialized in exploiting exactly their kind of vulnerability and desperation. What they didn't know was that someone had been following them since that first night at the diner. During those first few days of February 1990, something concerning was happening. Missing person flyers with Emily's photograph were appearing on shop windows throughout Orlando and the surrounding communities. Linda Parker had contacted authorities within hours of Emily's failure to return home, and law enforcement had responded with unusual speed because Emily's disappearance was so completely out of character. She had never stayed out late without permission, never failed to call if her plans changed, and never displayed any of the warning signs that typically preceded teenage runaway situations. The investigation was about to take a turn that nobody expected. When Ryan saw his girlfriend's face staring back at him from a convenience store window, the reality of their situation became clear. Emily was only 14 years old, barely a freshman in high school, and still very much a child in the eyes of the law. He was 18, already on probation for auto theft, and now technically involved in contributing to the delinquency of a minor and potentially other serious charges if prosecutors decided to pursue them. One phone call from Emily's parents could result in significant legal consequences for him, possibly for many years if the authorities decided to pursue maximum penalties. However, Ryan's legal troubles would soon become the least of their concerns. Despite Ryan's growing anxiety and increasingly desperate pleas that she return home before their situation became irreversible, Emily refused to even consider going back to her previous life. She had experienced independence and found it intoxicating, more powerful than any fear of consequences. More than that, she believed with the absolute certainty of first love that she and Ryan were meant to be together, that their connection transcended the mundane concerns of age differences and legal complications. The idea of returning to her mother's apartment, to her normal teenage life of school and babysitting jobs, and carefully supervised social activities, felt like abandoning everything she thought she wanted. What Emily didn't realize was that someone else had been making decisions about her future. When Ryan, driven by desperation and panic, suggested they run away permanently and start over somewhere far from Florida, where nobody knew them, Emily immediately agreed. They would hitchhike south toward Mexico, where Ryan claimed to have relatives who would help them disappear and begin their lives together without interference from law enforcement or concerned family members. It was a plan born of desperation, teenage naivety, and the kind of romantic fantasy that ignores practical realities. Unfortunately, it was also a plan that would put them directly in the path of a predator who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. The decision to hitchhike would prove to be fatal, though neither Emily nor Ryan understood the deadly game they were about to enter. In 1990, the interstate highway system that connected America's cities and made commerce possible also served as a hunting ground for serial criminals who used the anonymity of the road to find victims and dispose of evidence across state lines. Long-haul truckers in particular had access to what amounted to a mobile crime scene that could cross multiple jurisdictions before law enforcement even realized a crime had been committed. For a criminal like Robert Harris, his semi-truck wasn't just transportation or a means of making a living. It was something far more dangerous. The most concerning aspect of what happened next wasn't just that Emily and Ryan encountered a serial criminal, it was how easily they trusted him. Robert Harris had been perfecting his methods for years, developing and refining techniques for identifying, targeting, and controlling victims with methodical precision that made him one of the most successful serial criminals in American history. Born in 1954 in rural Texas, Harris had spent most of his adult life as a long-haul trucker, a profession that provided him with the perfect cover for his criminal activities while giving him access to potential victims across the entire continental United States. To truck stop waitresses, fellow drivers, and law enforcement officers who occasionally interacted with him, Harris appeared to be just another middle-aged man trying to make an honest living hauling freight across the country. He was polite but not overly friendly, paid his bills on time, and kept to himself in the way that many long-haul drivers did. However, Harris was concealing something that would shock even experienced investigators. Harris was a student of human psychology who had spent years learning how to identify the most vulnerable potential victims. He looked for runaways, hitchhikers, and anyone else who existed on the margins of society where their absence might not be quickly noticed or properly documented by authorities. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to assess a person's vulnerability within minutes of meeting them, reading subtle cues in their clothing, their posture, their willingness to trust a stranger, and their desperation level. What made Harris particularly dangerous was his patience and his ability to wait for the perfect opportunity. When Emily and Ryan began hitchhiking south from Orlando in early February 1990, they were looking for transportation that would take them toward the Mexican border and what they imagined would be a new life free from the complications of their past. What they found instead was Robert Harris, who offered them exactly what they were looking for: a long-distance ride with someone who seemed trustworthy, understanding, and willing to help two young people overcome the obstacles that society had placed in their path. Harris was a master manipulator who understood exactly how to put potential victims at ease, particularly young people who were running away from problems and desperately wanted to believe that someone would help them without asking too many questions. However, what Harris told them about himself was entirely fabricated. Harris likely spoke to Emily and Ryan about their plans, expressed understanding for their situation, and presented himself as someone who had once been young and idealistic himself, someone who understood what it meant to be misunderstood by family and authorities. He would have shared carefully crafted stories about his own youth, his own experiences, and his own struggles with people who didn't understand young love when they saw it. He might even have shown them photographs of a family that wasn't his, talked about children who didn't exist, and created an entire fictional identity designed to make them feel safe. However, the moment Emily and Ryan climbed into Harris's truck, they had made the last free decision they would ever make. The truck that Emily and Ryan entered wasn't just a means of transportation. Harris had spent years converting it into something designed for one purpose: to give him complete control over human beings while moving them across the country where no one would think to look for them. The sleeper cab had been modified with hidden restraints, soundproofing materials, and storage areas for equipment that served only criminal purposes. What Harris had created was a mobile prison, and Emily and Ryan had just become passengers on a journey that would end tragically. Harris had converted his truck's sleeper cab into what investigators would later describe as a mobile control center, equipped with hidden restraints, soundproofing materials, and specialized equipment designed to maintain complete control over his victims. He had studied techniques used by military interrogators and criminal psychologists throughout history, combining the most effective methods into a systematic approach to breaking down his victims' psychological and physical resistance. However, Harris had underestimated the strength and determination of Emily Parker. Emily Parker possessed an inner strength that even weeks of captivity couldn't completely destroy. Even while being held against her will and transported across the country in the sleeper cab of a semi-truck, she never stopped looking for a way to alert someone to their situation, never stopped fighting for survival, and never stopped hoping that somehow she and Ryan would find a way to escape or be rescued by the authorities who she believed must be looking for them. What Emily managed to accomplish while being held captive would ultimately lead to Harris's capture and conviction. It was Emily who convinced Harris to allow her to make phone calls home, calls that she hoped would somehow lead to their rescue, but which Harris viewed as an opportunity to inflict additional psychological pressure on her family while demonstrating his complete control over her situation. The calls were Emily's desperate attempt to leave a trail that law enforcement could follow, clues that might lead investigators to their location before it was too late to save them. However, Emily didn't know that Ryan was no longer alive. The first call came on March 16, 1990, more than 6 weeks after Emily had disappeared from her mother's apartment in Orlando. Emily's father, David Parker, answered the phone to hear an unfamiliar male voice on the other end of the line, a voice that was calling from Birmingham, Alabama, nearly 500 miles from where his daughter had last been seen. The man wanted to talk about Emily, but this wasn't Emily herself calling. It was her captor, using her desperate situation as a way to psychologically manipulate her family while feeding his own need for control and power. The caller claimed he had Emily with him, providing details that only someone who had spent significant time with her could know. When David Parker asked the critical question, "Is she still alive? Can I speak to her?" the line went dead. However, the calls were just beginning. The next day at exactly 1:15 p.m., the phone rang again. This time the caller was in Jackson, Mississippi, nearly 300 miles from where he had called the day before, demonstrating a mobility that suggested he was a long-haul trucker or someone else with access to reliable long-distance transportation. Again, he provided Emily's father with vague references to his daughter's condition and whereabouts, describing details about her appearance and personality that demonstrated intimate knowledge of her situation. The calls were brief, calculated, and designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on a family that was already suffering beyond measure. However, what the caller didn't realize was that Emily was using these calls to send a message. Harris also contacted Emily's mother, Linda, using the same cruel psychological tactics, but with a different approach designed to exploit a mother's desperate need to believe her child was still alive and could still be saved. He would claim he wanted to provide information about Emily's whereabouts, offer hints about her condition, and then arrange to meet Linda at specific locations where he would never appear. These phantom meetings served multiple purposes for Harris. They allowed him to observe Emily's family from a distance. They provided him with a sense of power and control over people who had never done anything to harm him. And they kept law enforcement focused on specific areas while he continued to move his victims across the country. However, the meetings would eventually provide investigators with crucial evidence. One particularly concerning aspect of these calls was Harris's knowledge of intimate details about Emily's life, information that demonstrated just how completely he had compromised her psychological defenses during the weeks of captivity. He knew her full name, her birth date, details about her family members and their relationships, specific information about the night she disappeared, and even private thoughts and feelings that Emily had shared with him during moments when she still believed he might be someone who would help her. This wasn't random information gathered from news reports or missing person flyers. It was intelligence that Harris had extracted from Emily herself through psychological manipulation techniques that investigators would later struggle to document in court. Every detail he shared with Emily's parents was another demonstration of just how completely he controlled their daughter's fate. Law enforcement was able to trace some of these calls to specific payphones, but Harris was always long gone by the time investigators arrived at the locations. The traces did, however, establish a pattern of movement that would later prove crucial to understanding the full scope of Harris's crimes and the routes he typically used when transporting victims across state lines. The calls showed that he was moving consistently westward and southward, using major interstate highways and stopping in cities that were typically 200 to 300 miles apart, exactly the kind of pattern you would expect from a long-haul trucker operating on a regular schedule. However, investigators still had no idea who they were looking for. While Emily's family clung to hope that these phone calls meant their daughter was still alive and might somehow be rescued, the reality was far more disturbing than they could have imagined. Behavioral analysts who would later study Harris's methods believed that he used the phone calls as part of his psychological manipulation of his victims, demonstrating his complete power over every aspect of their lives. Emily was likely forced to provide the personal information that Harris used during the calls, then made to listen as he used that information to cause additional distress to her parents, adding another layer of anguish to her already unbearable situation. However, Emily had already begun fighting back in ways that Harris didn't understand. The calls continued sporadically throughout March 1990, each one coming from a different location, but following the same cruel pattern of tantalizing hints, followed by abrupt disconnections that left Emily's family desperate for more information. Harris seemed to understand exactly how to calibrate the amount of information he provided, giving Emily's parents just enough hope to keep them emotionally invested while never providing anything that might actually help investigators locate him. However, Harris was making a crucial mistake that would eventually cost him his freedom. By late March 1990, the phone calls stopped completely. Emily's family, who had been living in a state of suspended animation between hope and despair for weeks, were left with only silence and the terrible knowledge that something fundamental had changed in their daughter's situation. They continued to hope, continued to wait for their phone to ring, continued to believe that somehow Emily would find a way to make contact or that Harris would resume his communications. But the silence stretched on day after day with no relief. They couldn't know that the phone calls had stopped because Emily Parker would never make another phone call. What Emily's family didn't know was that their daughter had passed away. On September 29, 1990, 7 months after Emily had disappeared and 6 months after the last phone call, a farmer outside Springfield, Illinois, made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. James Morrison was checking his property after a severe thunderstorm had damaged several of his outbuildings when he noticed something unusual in the loft of an old barn that he rarely used. The structure was over 50 years old, built during the Depression by his grandfather, and had been largely abandoned since he had built modern facilities closer to the main farmhouse. What Morrison found there was the remains of a young woman who had been deceased for months, but the discovery would soon reveal something far more concerning than a single murder. The Cook County coroner determined that the victim had likely passed away in early March, around the time that the phone calls to Emily's family had stopped. An autopsy revealed that she had died from ligature strangulation. Her clothing had been removed and was never recovered. Her hair had been cut in an uneven, haphazard manner that matched the description Harris had given during his phone calls, and there were signs that she had been restrained for an extended period before her death. The condition of the remains made identification difficult, but dental records eventually confirmed what Emily's family had been dreading. The body was Emily Marie Parker. However, Emily's death was just the beginning of a much larger and more horrifying story. The FBI's investigation into Emily's murder would eventually reveal that she had been the victim of one of America's most prolific serial criminals, a man who had been using the nation's highway system as his personal hunting ground for over a decade, leaving behind a trail of victims that stretched across multiple states and represented one of the most extensive killing sprees in American criminal history. The break in the case came not through traditional detective work, but through a combination of luck, advancing technology, and the kind of meticulous record-keeping that Harris had foolishly maintained throughout his criminal career. However, investigators were about to discover that Emily's case was connected to dozens of other unsolved disappearances. In January 1990, just weeks before Emily and Ryan had disappeared, an 18-year-old hitchhiker named Sarah Williams had managed to escape from Harris's truck after being held captive for several days. Her description of her attacker and his vehicle had been entered into a federal database, but without a name or license plate number, it had been just one more report among thousands of similar cases. Williams had provided investigators with detailed information about the interior of Harris's truck, including descriptions of the restraining devices, the soundproofing materials, and the photographs that covered one wall of the sleeper cab. She had also described Harris's methods in detail, how he selected victims, how he gained their trust, how he transported them across state lines, and how he used psychological manipulation to break down their resistance. However, Williams's report sat in a file until investigators made a connection that would change everything. The connection between Emily's case and Williams's escape wasn't made until April 1990, when Harris was arrested in Arizona on charges related to another serious crime. When police searched his truck and his home in Houston, Texas, they discovered what would later be described as a mobile control center that contained evidence of crimes spanning multiple states and more than a decade of systematic criminal activity. However, what they found in Harris's possession would shock even experienced investigators who thought they had seen everything. Harris's truck was equipped with hidden compartments, restraining devices, and soundproofing that allowed him to hold victims for extended periods without detection. The sleeper cab had been modified with anchor points for restraints, sound-dampening materials that prevented sounds from being heard outside the vehicle, and storage areas for the tools and equipment Harris used to maintain control over his victims. His home contained even more disturbing evidence: photographs of his victims in various states of distress, clothing and personal items taken as trophies, and detailed journals describing his crimes in language so concerning that prosecutors would later struggle to present them in court without traumatizing jury members. Among the hundreds of photographs found in Harris's possession were images that would devastate Emily's father. The pictures showed Emily with her hair cut short and uneven, exactly as Harris had described during those phone calls in March. Her expression in the photographs showed terror and desperation, but also something else that her father found both heartbreaking and inspiring. A stubborn refusal to completely surrender, the look of someone who knew that death was inevitable but was still fighting to survive and maintain some small measure of her humanity. However, perhaps the most chilling discovery was Emily's London fog coat, which Harris had kept as a trophy along with personal items from dozens of other victims. Inside one of the pockets, investigators found a small notebook that Emily had been carrying the night she disappeared. What they read inside that notebook would reveal additional horror about what Emily had endured. The notebook was filled with Emily's observations about life, love, and her hopes for the future with Ryan. But Harris had written in it as well, adding his own twisted commentary to Emily's innocent teenage thoughts about life and love, defiling her private thoughts with his own disturbed fantasies and criminal intentions. One entry, written in Harris's distinctive handwriting, simply read, "Ryan's gone." This single sentence confirmed what investigators had suspected but had been unable to prove. Harris had killed Ryan Mitchell before focusing his attention entirely on Emily, eliminating what he saw as a potential threat while also increasing his psychological control over his primary victim. However, investigators were about to discover something that would make the case even more disturbing. Ryan's body would not be discovered until May 26, 1990, when skeletal remains found near a creek bed outside Shreveport, Louisiana, were eventually identified through DNA testing as the 18-year-old who had convinced Emily to run away with him. The remains showed that Ryan had been shot in the head with a small caliber weapon, a relatively quick death compared to what Emily had endured during the weeks that followed his murder. Investigators believed that Harris had killed Ryan early in their captivity, possibly within the first few days, both to eliminate a potential physical threat and to increase his psychological control over Emily. The knowledge that her boyfriend was deceased, that the person she had trusted to protect her and help her start a new life had been murdered, would have made Emily even more compliant and desperate. However, Ryan's death was just the beginning of Harris's crimes against the two teenagers. The full scope of Harris's crimes would take years to unravel, revealing a pattern of violence that had been escalating for over 15 years. He had been killing since the mid-1970s, using his job as a long-haul trucker to find victims and dispose of evidence across the country. His method was always the same. He would pick up hitchhikers, runaways, or women in vulnerable situations, hold them captive in his truck for days or weeks while subjecting them to psychological manipulation, then kill them and dispose of their bodies in remote locations where they might never be found. However, investigators were beginning to realize that Emily and Ryan were just two victims in a killing spree that spanned multiple decades and dozens of victims. Among his confirmed victims were Candace and Douglas Wallace, a young married couple from Seattle who had been murdered in 1989. Douglas was killed immediately with a single gunshot to the head, but Candace was held captive for over a week and transported across multiple states to Utah before Harris finally killed her in a manner similar to Emily's death. The pattern was always the same: immediate execution for male victims who posed a physical threat and prolonged captivity for female victims who satisfied Harris's need for complete control over another person's life and death. Law enforcement officials estimated that Harris might have been responsible for as many as 50 murders over his 15-year killing spree, though many of his victims were never identified and their bodies never found. However, the investigation was about to reveal something that would change how law enforcement handles serial crimes forever. The investigation into Harris's crimes revealed fundamental flaws in how law enforcement agencies communicated with each other across state lines, weaknesses that Harris had exploited for over a decade. In 1990, there was no centralized database for tracking serial crimes, no system for connecting similar cases in different jurisdictions, and no protocols for sharing information about suspects who might be operating across multiple states. Harris had exploited these weaknesses systematically, committing crimes in one state and disposing of evidence in another, making it nearly impossible for investigators to see the full pattern of his activities until he was finally apprehended. Emily Parker's case became a catalyst for changes that would help prevent similar crimes in the future. The trial of Robert Harris was a significant legal proceeding that exposed the American public to the reality of interstate serial crime in a way that had never happened before. Harris's methods, his victim count, and the mobile nature of his crimes captured the attention of a public that was just beginning to understand how the nation's highway system could be used by predators who understood how to exploit the anonymity and mobility that the interstate system provided. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence that painted a picture of Harris as one of the most prolific and dangerous serial criminals in American history. However, Harris's reaction to his conviction would shock everyone in the courtroom. Harris was ultimately convicted of multiple murders, including Emily Parker's. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Photographs of his victims, personal belongings taken as trophies, detailed journals describing his crimes, and testimony from the few victims who had managed to survive their encounters with him. He was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole and remains incarcerated at Menard Correctional Center in Chester, Illinois, where he will spend the rest of his life in protective custody. During his sentencing, Harris showed no remorse for his crimes and seemed to view the trial as an opportunity to relive his murders in a public forum. He spoke briefly about his activities, referring to his murders as if they had been something other than acts of unspeakable cruelty. However, Harris's final statement would reveal something about his mindset that investigators had never fully understood. Harris claimed that his victims had been willing participants in their own situations, a statement so divorced from reality that it provided chilling insight into the mind of someone who had spent decades dehumanizing other people for his own gratification. He seemed genuinely surprised that society viewed his actions as criminal, suggesting that he had created an elaborate fantasy world in which he was providing something beneficial to his victims rather than harming them. This psychological profile would later be used by the FBI to identify and capture other serial criminals who operated with similar methods and justifications. Emily Parker's story became a cautionary tale that resonated far beyond the immediate details of her case. Her death highlighted the vulnerability of teenagers who run away from home, the dangers of hitchhiking, and the ways that predators exploit the trust and desperation of young people who are trying to escape difficult situations. Her case became required reading in law enforcement academies and criminal justice programs, a textbook example of how serial criminals operate and how their crimes can be prevented and solved. However, Emily's legacy goes far beyond the educational value of her case. The phone calls that Harris had used to manipulate Emily's family ultimately provided crucial evidence for his conviction. The pattern of movement established by those calls helped investigators understand the scope of his crimes and connect him to other cases across multiple states. Emily's determination to somehow alert her family to her situation, even while being held captive by a serial criminal, played a direct role in ensuring that her murderer was eventually caught and punished. In death, Emily Parker helped solve not just her own murder, but the murders of dozens of other victims whose cases had remained unsolved for years. Today, Emily Parker is remembered not just as a victim, but as a young woman whose courage and determination helped law enforcement solve one of the most significant serial murder cases in American history. Her case led to important improvements in how police agencies share information about interstate crimes, and her story continues to serve as a reminder of the importance of protecting vulnerable young people who might be targeted by predators. The highway rest stops and truck stops where Harris found many of his victims now have better lighting, increased security, and improved communication systems that make it harder for predators to operate undetected. The impact of Emily Parker's case extended far beyond the courtroom and the prison where Robert Harris would spend the rest of his life. Her story became a turning point in how America understood and responded to the threat of interstate serial criminals who used the nation's highway system to hunt for victims. In the years following Harris's conviction, the FBI established new protocols specifically designed to identify and track serial offenders who operated across state lines. The Highway Serial Killings Initiative, launched years later, was directly inspired by cases like Emily's and has since helped solve dozens of similar crimes. The Emily Parker Foundation, established by her family in 1995, has provided support and resources for families of missing children and has helped fund improvements in how law enforcement responds to reports of missing teenagers. The foundation has also worked to educate young people about the dangers of running away from home and the predators who specifically target vulnerable teenagers who are trying to escape difficult situations. Through this work, Emily's memory continues to protect other young people who might otherwise fall victim to predators like Robert Harris. Emily Marie Parker was 14 years old when she made the decision to run away from home with a boy she thought she loved. She was trying to escape what she saw as the restrictions of her teenage life, looking for adventure and independence, and the kind of romance that she had read about in books and seen in movies. Instead, she found herself trapped in a nightmare that lasted for weeks and ended in a barn outside Springfield, Illinois, 800 miles from the home she had been so eager to leave behind. However, Emily's final legacy is not the manner of her death, but the way her case helped expose and ultimately stop one of America's most dangerous criminals. The phone calls she somehow convinced her captor to make, the evidence she helped preserve through her courage and determination, and the investigation that her case sparked all contributed to ensuring that Robert Harris would never hurt anyone else. Emily's story reminds us that every life has value, that justice is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, and that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can find ways to fight back against evil and leave a legacy that protects others from suffering the same fate. This is Emily Parker's story, and it serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of family communication, stranger danger awareness, and the ongoing work of law enforcement to protect vulnerable young people from those who would exploit them. If Emily's courage in making those desperate phone calls gave you chills like it did me, please smash that like button and share this video with everyone you care about. I'm not asking for myself. I'm asking because the safety awareness in this story could literally prevent someone from becoming the next victim. These predators are counting on us to stay silent and uninformed. Seriously, guys, your support means everything. Without subscribers like you, we can't afford to spend months investigating these cases or traveling to interview the families and law enforcement officers who live through these nightmares. Please subscribe, please comment, and please share, because together we can make sure Emily Parker's legacy continues to protect innocent people. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for watching and for caring enough to learn about these cases. Until next time, trust your instincts, stay alert, and remember your engagement helps bring justice to forgotten victims. Stay safe out there and please, please subscribe.